Welcome to episode 64 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning here talking to you from my little house in Greater London. Thanks for joining me again, or maybe for the first time. If you're a returning listener, you know the deal. And if you're new, you have about an hour of movie history conversation ahead of you. Thanks for all the nice comments about episode 64, in which I spoke to ILM VFX rebel Steve Williams. Steve and I have been chatting a little bit on WhatsApp. He's interested to hear the feedback from the podcast, and it's been fun watching the reactions to Jurassic Park, the documentary of which Steve is the main subject. This is the last episode of 2022, so I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for listening and for your support. There really is a core group of you on Twitter and Facebook that always reply and share, and I'm so grateful to you. There's lots more in the pipeline for 2023, so please stay in touch and please keep sharing. Just a quick mention of our documentary project, Not Your Average Joe, the documentary about production designer Joe Alves. It finished on Kickstarter on December the 20th, and sadly, despite our best efforts, we didn't reach our target of 80,000, despite a last-minute rally. We did manage to raise nearly 45,000, but because of the all-or-nothing nature of Kickstarter, we won't see a penny of it. Paddy and myself spent hours a day creating social media posts. It really was a full-time job for much of those 30 days. We learned a hell of a lot during the campaign, and we're pretty confident that if we gave it another go at a different time, we could reach a higher level of support. And we did realise that it wasn't the best timing leading up to Christmas, but it was also the only period of time we could commit to, as we're both so busy for the remainder of the year. Patrick and I, Patrick being the co-director, are regrouping in early 2023 and are going to see what we can do next. In fact, we're already talking about another self-funded trip to Los Angeles and San Francisco to carry out some more interviews for the documentary. It isn't cheap, and we don't really have a budget. We're just doing this out of our own pockets, sacrificing other things. But we also don't want to be demotivated by the Kickstarter. I'm not going to call it a failure. I think we did really well to get 45 grand, but yeah, the Kickstarter is not going to demotivate us anyway. If a campaign is unsuccessful on Kickstarter, you don't even get the contact details of the people that backed it. Understandably, it's their platform and they make the rules. But if you did back the campaign and still want to be notified of the progress of the project or about any future funding campaigns, please email us on joealvesdoc, that's JoeAlvesdoc, joealvesdoc@gmail.com. This film is definitely going to happen because we're going to make sure of it. Okay, back to the business of this week's episode. So just before Christmas, I spoke with Rose Degnan, and if you watched Light and Magic on Disney+, you'll have seen Rose, a long-time employee at ILM. She filled several roles during her years there, including production assistant, production supervisor, and a role in marketing. So here's my chat with Rose, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So Rose, how did you begin in the industry? What was your entry point? Was it something you were aiming for, or was it a happy accident?
I think that I was ready to drop out of college. I went to Stanford University, and it was free because my dad worked at Hoover Institute. And I was about to drop out because I just didn't feel like I fit in. And this woman who I think my dad had a huge crush on, she's a beautiful Jamaican Africanist woman. And she said to me, the voice of women is needed in film. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's a cool idea, the voice of women. So I decided to make a film about women's subjects. Like I made a documentary as a Stanford student about how to have an orgasm. I thought that was super important. Still is. Anyway, so I make this film, and I really got, how if you find something where the hours go by, and editing, just the hours would go by, and suddenly it would be like midnight. And so I made this film. I got distribution. I made more money than my poor dad did ever on 50 books. So I made this film, and I decided to pursue a career in filmmaking, documentaries. This was 1974. I moved to LA. This was before internet. So I called every single production company in the phone book. It took a week, 9 to 5. And I got 4 interviews and I got a job. And I was working for Stan Dragati. His claim to fame is he went to jail for cocaine, strapping cocaine to his body and going to con. What an idiot. But he was married to Cheryl Tiggs, who's a supermodel. And she used to come into the office. Oh my gosh, the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. No makeup, just pure, perfect skin, perfect blonde hair. She was so pretty. And she told her husband, I need to take her shopping because she needs to only wear black, white, and red. So I got into the business that way, being his assistant, worked on big commercials. You know, yesterday Franco Harris died. I met Franco Harris. I wanted to marry Franco Harris. I mean, he was the most beautiful man. He wanted me to have his children, but I was married at the time. So I called my husband and I said, wouldn't you be proud if I were to go to Philadelphia with Franco? He said, no, not going to happen. So anyway, I was ambitious and I ended up hiring a lot of my friends to be the secretary so I could be on the set. And finally, Stan Dragati said, why don't you just be our coordinator and you'll make 3 times the money. We won't work every day. And so I did that. And that's how I fell into Star Wars because I did an series of Army movies and I worked really hard. I was props, coordinator, runner, wardrobe, makeup. I was everything. And so the guy that got hired on Star Wars hired me. And I came in, if you saw Light and Magic, you'll see I came in with the grown-ups. Like they had already spent all the money. They had delivered nothing.
So this was quite late on at this point, was it?
Principal
photography had finished?
The principal photography had finished. George returns. We had 1 year to deliver. And actually 10 months to deliver. It was a year from release. And George almost had a heart attack because nothing was done. And that's when he decided to bring in George Mather. And I was hired to be George Mather's assistant. And truthfully, I was young, fun. George just sat in his office, but it was his systems that I implemented and I just made it fun, and we had a good time. And I was very, very lucky, I feel, to work with such a talented group of people and deliver Star Wars. I mean, a movie that has gone on to affect so many generations. I see grandfathers and grandchildren wearing Star Wars t-shirts. Yeah. It's just a phenomenon that is really hard to understand.
It is. And what was your kind of day-to-day job then? You're keeping everybody in check and just trying to organise, along with Mr. Mather, you mentioned there, he brought in a system that meant that you could really get, the production in shape and know where everything was, every shot was, at what stage it was at.
Precisely. Yeah. He created a list of there was not even a list of every shot and every element. So he had like a Bible of every shot, every element, and where it was. And he would keep track of, okay, this has now been shot on stage. It's moving to roto for the mats, and here it's moving to optical. And my job was really to work with John Dykstra. When George was there, I followed George around and took notes on everything he said. When he wasn't there, which was 4 days a week, I worked with Dykstra, and we would sit at the Moviola and put together shots. And I would just take notes, this shot, this X-wing, comes in here and it goes on top of this. And then we would get that into optical. So it was very much part of the team and very much like, what any PA does. You just are doing details all day long. But my main job was to follow George around and take notes and follow John Dykstra around and take notes and then work at the Moviola with him. And it was such a different time because there was zero sexism. I mean, these were all young men. No one had kids. Everybody just made the work their life. And that, I think, is what Light and Magic captured, was the youthful spirit of total dedication to the job. And that spirit has continued at ILM, but I really do credit the young people, pre-children. Once I started having kids, I actually switched out of production because I did marketing.
Yeah.
And I just knew that with 3 little kids, there was just no, with even the first kid, there
Yeah.
was no way.
Gets
You
too
know, you're a
oh yeah,
dad.
I've got 3 kids and it gets too complicated. I mean, but I'm just thinking though, like you've done this documentary, but you're coming into this movie and you want to be in filmmaking, and you've arrived in filmmaking, but the language that they're using in the effects world must be very different to the language you're used to making documentaries. I mean, you must have been learning on your feet, thinking on your feet, asking lots of questions, presumably.
Really, really sensitive of you to realize they use the word like pylon, and I
Mm.
spelled it PILE-ON. I had no idea what a pylon was. You know, it's what holds the ship in
Yeah.
place. Yeah, there was a lot of learning curve, but this was like a very, you know, I would type up my notes at the end of the day, and then George Mather would say, no, pylon is PYLON, you know, so then I learned. The only time I really got in trouble once was for Dickie Alexander. He was a machinist, and he told me this batch of items needs to go out for anodizing. And I thought, okay, well, I'll do it tomorrow. No, 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 no. He had held him up for a whole day because that stuff should have come back that day and he could have used it in his machining. So there was a lot of terms that I didn't realize how important
Hmm.
anodizing was, or but yeah, it was, we were all learning. I mean, look at that. We were reinventing visual effects. That's why George said there was no way to do his movie
Mm.
with there didn't even exist any effects departments at studios anymore. So he had no choice but to take this ragtag group of rebels and create a team that almost didn't make it. But then they brought in George Mather and me and the sort of the grown-ups, and we got everything organized. So then George loves detail. He just loves to know what percentage is in this and what percentage is in that and what percentage we have to go. And so for years after, you know, I moved up with the ILM people after Star Wars was released. And I used to tell him going into the screening room, we need 10 CBBs. We need, CBBs are could be betters, but you know, go
I
ahead
remember
and say.
Dennis Muren telling me that. It's something I only found out recently. I'm learning as well.
I wonder if anyone uses CBBs anymore. No, nowadays it's iteration, iteration, iteration with the digital. But in those days, you basically, you know, unless you wanted to spend another 12 hours redoing that shot in optical, it was so complex. Just simple shots, 4-element shots took like 16 times through the optical printer, you know, and a printer is basically a camera and a projector tied together, and you're just frame by frame doing mats, and then I mean, it was very complex. I did a show 3 years ago at the Academy where we compared the all analog tools of Star Wars with the all digital tools of Rogue One.
Huh.
And if you saw Rogue One, you saw that that was like, in a way, a predecessor of Star Wars, because it explains how Princess Leia got the Death Star plans. And the complexity of the old school opticals was just phenomenal. But as John Dykstra said on stage that day, he said, it's the most fun I've ever had. And Bruce Nicholson and I are in the audience, and we look at each other, tears are in our eyes. You know, Bruce won an Academy Award on Empire, I believe.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the thing is, you talk about the fun. I've seen those pictures. You know, I've interviewed Lorne Peterson. He's got a great collection of pictures of everyone in, you know, Van Nuys there, and the hot tub and the slip and slide and all of that stuff. I mean, it's very easy to imagine you all having a great time, but everyone was working crazy hours as well, weren't they? I mean, how did you, as somebody who was you know, production assistant and later as a coordinator and producer, how do you kind of keep tabs and make sure that the workforce is actually being, you know, looked after in a responsible manner as well? Because that's something that's crept into film work. People just give their lives over to it, don't they?
So true. We were called a country club way back when on Star Wars by the studio. And I'll tell you where that name originated. One day, it was a hot day. A lot of people were in the hot tub, you know, women wearing their underwear, men wearing their underwear. And John Dykstra, our leader, was taking an old refrigerator that had busted and lifting it high on a forklift and then crashing it onto the cement of the drive over and over. And everyone was laughing. And up pulls a limo with Gary Kurtz, producer, George Lucas, director, and Alan Ladd Jr. from
Wow.
20th Century Fox. And they get out of the car and they look at this scene and they get right back in the car and leave. That is when George wanted to fire John Dykstra, because this is like, but you see, we were working so hard and so long hours that taking an hour off in the afternoon to let off steam was no big deal. I mean, I'm sure Mary Lind was in there. She ran film control. That woman knew where every single piece of film was. We had the hardest working crowd. People would sleep in the screening room. So, as I said, no one had kids. Everybody just dedicated themselves. And so even though we did slip and slide, even though, we were immature, there was a tremendous dedication to the workforce. And I see that to this day. Now, you ask what I would do to encourage that. I mean, we had Dykstra, who was such a charismatic leader. But once we got up north and we had, like on Return of the Jedi, 40th anniversary coming up, I'm hoping to do a party. I used to do things, there was never money. Like I remember some guys stayed up all night to redo a shot because we really needed it to close out that reel. And he did it. And he couldn't even put in for overtime for it because, it was his mistake that he had to redo the shot. So I remember calling him into my office and I said, get your mom on the phone. So he calls his mom and I put her on speaker. And I just said, what a great job you've done raising this young man. He is such a gift to this company and he is such a hard worker. Well, we all start crying, so much more meaningful than money, right?
Yeah, you just want to feel valued, right? That your work is valued and your contribution is valued. Yeah.
I think that is the secret. If you can make people feel appreciated, yes, you do parties. And I'm famous for my parties.
Yeah.
Right through Star Wars, right through Jedi. I remember on Thanksgiving, it was just a brutal time because on Jedi, George, like 3 days before Thanksgiving, had cut out like 50 shots that we'd already like shot elements for. They were in various places. And he just realized he didn't need them. And so, but he added another 20. So it was like Black Friday, and I decided, let's have a Thanksgiving. Since we're going to work through Thanksgiving weekend, let's have a Thanksgiving party. And we, ordered beautiful food and set up tables and had flowers and wine on the table. And I remember Marsha Lucas and George came by and to look at dailies or something. And we invited them to join us. And Marsha says, well, I have work to do. So she leaves. And I'm like, oh no, George sat down. He didn't have any wine, but he did sit down and enjoy the meal with us. So really parties, gatherings, but more than that, it's appreciation of the worker, I think, that matters. And that can happen to this day. There's no reason that there is a reason that people stay at a company, and it is because they are appreciated.
Yeah, there is that need to kind of have those moments. I mean, that was bad timing with Gary and Alan Ladd and George turning up, right? I mean, it wasn't reflective of what was going on there, but you need those moments to decompress, don't you? You need, that whole thing about, work hard, play hard might not necessarily convert into what you guys were doing, but you do need that little vent at the end of a week or the end of a busy day.
You need that. And the people, when George got back from England and shooting, maybe he was in Tunisia, I don't recall, but all the live action was wrapped and he came back and there was, if you see Light and Magic, Ken Ralston says he walked to the screening room and there was a lot of screaming going on. I'm sure George wanted to get rid of Dykstra, but all those workers were Dykstra's friends. So if he had gotten rid of Dykstra, it wouldn't happen. So he was forced to deal with him and accept him. And actually, John's wife said to me, in Light and Magic, that was the first nice thing that George had ever said about Star Wars, when he said they did the best they could. They worked really hard. That meant a lot to Dykstra. And then you saw that trembling chin in Light and Magic.
I did spot that, yeah.
The director, Lawrence Kasdan, asked him, well, how did it feel to be left behind and not be invited up? to Return of the Jedi, to Empire and Return of the Jedi. And John's quivered,
Mm.
that must have really, really hurt. I mean, he went on to create Apogee and they did lots of work. And now he's won another couple Academy Awards for Spider-Man, and he's a great guy. But that had to hurt a lot. And now at that point, we had 3 effects supervisors on Jedi. We had Richard Edlund, Ken Ralston, and Dennis Viren. So we were okay, but I don't think it was ever as fun as it was with Dykstra. He's just a very charismatic, happy dude. Ken is fun. But Ken is more like fun with his crew. He's not, step to the front of the crowd. He's so funny. He's so dry. Dennis is just pure artist, and then Richard's just get it done, but blow it up. I mean, Richards, loves guns and
Yeah, you get that sense from Dykstra watching Light and Magic that it's almost like the fifth Beatle or something. He was removed from the group, and then this great success happened. But like you say, he had success of his own. But you can see it still means a lot to him because, wow, what a turning point that was for movies. I mean, I was born in '76, so Star Wars has existed all my conscious life,
oh my
And
gosh.
did you? How much of a sense did you get when you were working on it from what you were seeing? Did you obviously got to go in dailies and things and look at shots that are coming from location and effects work that was going on. How were you able to sort of assemble it in your mind as to what it might end up being? I mean, it was all these disparate parts coming together, and George wrangled it into something amazing. But just for somebody who was seeing snippets here and there.
There was no way. Even George was
Mm.
so shocked. I remember being in the mixing studio. We were doing like foreign release mixes, and we were on Hollywood Boulevard doing that at some post-production facility. And I would have, ordinarily I would be the one to go out and pick up Hamburger Hamlet or whatever dinner. And for some reason, George said, well, I just need to get out. And he walks down the street and there's all this chaos and police and people around the block in costume. It was an opening of Star Wars at Grauman's Chinese. And people had already seen it once and come back. Even he was shocked. He comes back. He forgot dinner, by the way. He comes back and he starts getting calls from Alan Ladd Jr., from Steven Spielberg, from all his friends saying, oh my God, you have a massive hit on your hands. No one saw that coming. No one. I mean, it seemed corny, like watching the dailies and the corniness of it. I went to the screening in San Francisco, which was for kids. It's the famous screening. It was Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. The famous screening where there was like a standing ovation to the very first shot of that giant Star Destroyer coming over. And I brought my parents. And after, George was like, what are you doing here? I said, well, I live here. My parents live here and they wanted to see it. So we go out to the Sheraton Palace or something. And my parents were in love with this movie because they said it reminded them so much of serials from their youth, that you see little bits and pieces. And that was the tone of this film. Very different tone than other movies at the time. And to think that spurred this visual effects revolution, which, let's face it, I mean, it has exploded. And, at the time, there were 75 of us credited on Star Wars visual effects. There were 365 shots. That's easy to remember because days of the year. Now, thousands and thousands of shots and 1,000 people get credited on these movies. I just saw Avatar 2. Unbelievable visual effects. And to think that that we laid the groundwork. And then when you look at the history, I thought Lawrence Kasdan did an masterful job on that documentary, because even if you're not that interested in ILM, it really captures the history of visual effects and how we slowly, like overnight, became a digital company. That was a very painful time for us. Yeah.
But the first time you kind of got involved in digital stuff, there was CGI kind of creeping in at that point.
That our very first digital moment was on Return of the Wrath of Khan, Star
Yeah.
Trek,
Yeah.
and the Genesis effect, and that's well
Yes.
documented in the documentary. But that was a really interesting time, and of course it was on a monitor because there was no film in, film out
Yeah.
method
Hmm.
yet. And then after that, it was it did Death Becomes Her, and we did Young Sherlock,
Willow.
and
Yeah. Mm.
Willow was a big turning point. Yeah. And where we were working with Pixar next door to us, George started. And then when they decided George let him go and sold him to Steve Jobs, we were all like, okay, good, because they gave us a ton of software, but it was really Dennis Murin leading the effort. And then, of course, I had that great hire of John Knoll.
Mm.
So it was those two that really uh, had a burgeoning visual effects department within ILM just to do the effects. And that's when we tackled Terminator, and that's when we tackled, Jurassic Park. That I remember crying watching those dinosaurs in the screening room, and just crying knowing that everything was going to change. We didn't have those dinosaurs anymore, that everything was going to change at that moment. And I was right.
I recently interviewed Steve Williams
Oh,
um,
yeah.
about his input on Jurassic Park, and I know he's very outspoken. But you know
Yeah.
what? He said how lovely you were, and he was saying she's a wonderful woman, and
Oh.
I've always been very fond of her, and yeah, so
Yeah, I was really sad to see all that negativity come out, because we have been such a strong team, and Dennis and Phil Tippett and Dennis Murin felt like he threw him under the bus. I never saw the
mm,
documentary where he purportedly did that. He's been nothing but, sweet and kind to me. I had to uninvite him to a party. Hopefully this will be water under the bridge, because Steve was a huge contributor to our success on Jurassic Park. And I hate to see that color any.
yeah. I mean, Steve says himself, he wasn't a player of the politics, and he wasn't trying to climb the ladder like other people have done in the company, and he was just somebody who just wanted to be problem solving day to day, and he kind of admits to himself that that's a shortcoming, really, and he wasn't going to necessarily last in a business like that where you were expected to climb. So, fair play to him for acknowledging that, I guess. But I think the thing that kind of still haunts him is I think he doesn't feel like he's had the recognition that
Well,
he
the movie, I
deserves.
thought I wrote him after I said, you did a great job and you came across really well in that film. Such a rebel, he was very different than our other effects people. All those parties they gave. I mean, at that point I already had kids, so I would go home. I had an office just above the pit, as they call it. But at that point I was a mom, so I needed to get home, and needed to go pick up my kids from daycare.
How did that kind of change? I mean, obviously it changes your life hugely when you have kids, but we talk about being in a job where not necessarily expected to work very long hours, but it's part and parcel of filmmaking. Like we said, you hand your life over to a certain extent. How were you able to kind of manage that with having a new child and being a mum for the first time?
The company is George Lucas himself, very supportive of becoming a parent. And for example, I knew I couldn't be head of production anymore, because you can't have a child and get home at 6:30. You can't pick up your child at 6, because the night crew's just arriving and you got to review everything with them. So once I had kids, I gave up the production supervisor role and decided, I'd been collecting all these phone calls. In those days, you would have those little pads of paper, and the receptionist would write down that so and so from, Wyden Kennedy called and wants you to do a commercial. And the receptionist knew that we don't do commercials, so she would just tell them, and they would say, "Well, talk to somebody. You give this note to somebody." So I would collect them, and I had like 100 calls from commercial production companies. And I remember I was now pregnant with my second child, And I remember we were laying people off, and it was after Jedi, and it was just seemed like, why are we laying people off when we have all this potential work? So we started a commercial division. So I didn't have anything to do with that. I just continued to work in marketing. What a fun job. I would go to LA like every 2 weeks. To be able to pitch ILM, it was kind of an easy job, because until then we had only been doing George and his friends movies. And then we expanded it beyond that and started accepting a lot of other work, and everybody wanted to work there. So it really, but yeah, the good thing about working at Lucasfilm was, okay, so I had 2 kids. I was pregnant with my third, doing marketing. And I had this idea that we should have a daycare center. And I talked to Doug Norby, who was the president. He came to us from Fairchild, where they had a daycare center. So he knew the value. Because if your child, you know this, if your child is happy at a daycare center, you're not going to take a job for another 25% increase in salary because your kid is happy. So it was a really good investment. And even though, I stood in front of the company meeting, and I was pregnant, and I had a 3-year-old in one hand, a 4-year-old in another. And I said, I to the crowd, I want to have your babies. We want to start this daycare center, and I need you all to sign up. Nobody signed up but me that day, because you're not going to sign up for something that you don't know.
Sure.
You got to teachers, you got to see this facility. So the company went ahead and invested, I think, 50 grand in a facility. It was at a church, and I hired these great people who ran Marin Day School, and they started up this daycare with my 3 kids in it. That was the beginning. And it has been, now it's like 40 years later, 38 years later, and it has a wait list. It has had a wait list from like 5 months in. And people are so grateful. They come up to me all the time and say, like, I was on the stage at the Star Wars celebration. We were promoting Light and Magic. And Lynn Brennan, who's president of Lucasfilm, thanked me publicly on that stage because her child went to that daycare and she couldn't have done it. You have to, if your kid is happy and on site and you can go visit in the day, it's a terrific.
Yeah, a great legacy to have left there as well, like you to be a part of that. I was wondering, in your time there, we kind of see somebody like you talking, clearly a person who's very has a huge aptitude for organization and being able to bring things in on time and keeping tabs on everything. How do you manage to balance all of that with creating a space that allows people to be creative? I mean, some of these people, like Phil Tippett, I mean, he's an incredible artist. I can't imagine he's great at doing his tax return, for instance, or something like that.
Yes.
So how do you have those two environments kind of side by side without one kind of getting in the way of the other?
Very good question. I am extremely organized. I hate inefficiency. And the worst thing to me is somebody working on a shot that's already been edited out in the screening, in the editing suite next door. So I would keep very up to date on the editorial, and I just hated wasting time. But I am not a creative. My friends at the Academy of Motion Picture, they keep calling me and, oh, you should be in it, let's get you in it. And I said, you're looking for creative producers that really care about how it looks. So many people cared about how it looked at ILM that I felt that would be a luxury. So I just focused on good enough, CBBs, let's move on. And I remember one guy told me, I pried him loose from the stage. I said, "You're done. You're out of here. That's it, wrap." I don't remember doing that, but that's kind of, and I'm sure I would do it, gracefully and with a joke, because I was never intimidating to people. I would really listen. I remember we had some struggles with Richard Edlund because he used to really want to have backup cameras, and he would always want the best cameras. And so poor Dennis, was looking for a camera, and he was relegated with this old Rama. And so I had to get the coordinator to loosen up and tell Richard, "Look, if this camera goes down, we'll substitute. We'll pull this one from Richard, but let's let him have it for now." And of course, the camera never went down. So you just kind of have to, but Richard, God bless him, he was doing that because he cared so much, right, about the quality of the shot, and he wants to use the best camera. And if it jams, he wants a backup. And so it wasn't like ego that made that happen. It was caring about the outcome. And I just felt the need to balance that with, let's be realistic. I remember one guy was take 99 on something, on Trek something, Star Trek. And I remember just going out and saying, this set is done. You're done. Take 99. I mean, come on. And that's where, I didn't care if they had the perfect shot. I just knew out of 99 takes, you better be done. Let's move on to the next setup. And so I just kept things moving. I'm very amazing about budgeting. I come like within $100 but it's just an instinct that I have, this is going to take this long and this many people, and then you just adjust. You're always adjusting, okay, so you trade me. You've taken an extra day on this element, then you're not going to get the 3 days that we budgeted on this element. And everybody was like, okay, because everybody likes to be on budget and on time.
When you arrive there in the industry, though, you talk about kind of, asking all the questions and what does this mean? How do you spell this and all those things? So you didn't necessarily have anybody like a mentor that had done what you were doing in front of you. You had these people surrounding you that were supportive by the sound of things. But did you then ever kind of become somebody else's mentor within ILM, do you think?
Yes, I have been told that a lot of people saw me as a mentor, just as a woman able to hold her own in a group of male supervisors. I never, maybe because I had a really great title, production supervisor. We didn't have producers. We had production coordinators, which were so uneven to the effect supervisors. But me as a production supervisor, I could argue, well, wait a minute, why is that going to take 5 days? When it's so unusual. Oh, okay. Well, you need 5 days for that. Well, then can you do this in 2? And I guess I've always been kind of fearless. My dad had 5 girls and 1 boy, and he taught us how to play baseball, and he taught us, he always couldn't understand why nobody wanted to date us.
and strong for the guys out there.
We were just like smart, and we didn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny.
Good for you.
And so I've just always been that way, and always been like a really strong role model. The truth is, George was kind of a mentor because he was very, very patient with me, with terminology and such. He would take time to explain. And I remember, I would always follow him around when he came to ILM in the early days. And he used to say things like, all that matters in this movie is the first 5 minutes and the last 10. And I've never heard a director say that before. And I thought, God, that is so smart, because you got to suck people in, then they go along for the ride, and then you got to give them something to talk about at the end. And I thought that was super bright of him. And then he also said, he was disappointed in how things turned out on Star Wars. I don't think he was so disappointed on Empire. That looked amazing. And by Jedi, he wasn't that disappointed, because we did so much more. We did like 3 times the number of shots, 10 times the number of elements. So he had to be pretty pleased with that. But he was disappointed on Star Wars. And he said, I just wish that I had a black box and I could do it all myself.
Hmm. Must be
And
frustrating for somebody with such a creative mind to relinquish control to so many other people to kind of make that dream. I mean, I can understand that. I've worked on projects where you think you're just getting in my way, but I need you on this, because I can't do it all
yes.
myself.
And look at the studio system. I mean, he
Yeah.
really shook that up because on American Graffiti, he didn't have the power and they like recut his movie and substituted music. He ended up because Coppola stepped in
Yeah.
and guaranteed that he was able to get the movie that he wanted. And I loved that movie, which is why when I heard about Star Wars, I thought, oh, I want to work on this because that guy did a great job on
Mm.
American Graffiti.
Actually, didn't you tell the story? I think I read an interview. It might have been on StarWars.com or Lucasfilm somewhere about when you first arrived. You thought George was like a runner or something. And
Oh yeah. Well, he's so young. He wasn't even 30.
yeah, yeah. There he is in his
And
sneakers.
I come into this dump. I mean, the reception area, old desk, old couch, really bad. And I sit down, I start asking the receptionist all these questions because I know I'm about to go in for an interview with Dykstra and Lucas and George Mather. So I wanted to, hey, what do you tell me more about this movie? Blah, blah, blah. She was so weird. And then I hop up to go in for the interview. My name is called, and he follows me in. I'm thinking, cheeky kid. Because he's just been sitting there with his feet up on the table, And he only asked those two questions. He said, do you take shorthand? I said, no, but I write really fast. Can you start Monday? So I did. And I think I made $50 a day, which was a lot. I mean, I have the yellow legal pad of who was making what. And the person making the most money was John Dykstra at $500 a week. Joe Johnston was like $350. Lauren Peterson was $300. Steve Golly $300. Just crazy.
Yeah, you're doing all right back then. I mean, I
I
started
was
in
doing
the
all
industry.
right.
I started in the industry in 2000 in TV, and I was only getting, I think, £100 then. Well, that's for a day, but
Wow. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So when you worked on Return of the Jedi, production supervisor, right? Yeah, the most complex optical effect movie ever at that point. I mean, I was kind of woken up to this. I've mentioned this several times on the podcast. There was a show called How to Film the Impossible, where you remember
Leslie
that?
Iwerks did that.
Yeah, and I remember just seeing that grid of all of the ships where they were going to pass. This ship was going to pass this grid, and
I
past this ship, and
know.
there's a little X there, and it kind of blew my
I
mind
know.
that not only could those guys kind of visualize but they could execute it in a way that would look convincing. I mean, I can still can't even still imagine now doing that in a computer. I mean, I don't really know about visual effects myself, but just being able
Uh-huh.
to understand scale and the movement of each of those elements. I mean, kind of crazy what you guys were doing back then.
I know the level of complexity and the super abilities really in optical and roto,
Mm,
as well as on stage, shooting those elements in such a way. Um, it was breaking new ground every single shot, and especially on Jedi, because I mean on Star Wars, I think the most complicated shot was like 6 elements. There were 80,
hmm
90 elements. Can you imagine what that optical lineup sheet looks like when you have 90 elements? And you'd be standing all night and it would take you 12 hours to shoot that shot.
Yeah.
And you make one mistake. I remember once some guy on a 80 element shot, SB 81, where all the ships, all the TIE fighters are flying to camera. He made one mistake. It was lower left-hand corner, left a mat in or something. And he admitted it. The optical photographer admitted it in the screening room. And George Lucas said, if everyone's looking at the lower left part of the screen, we have lost them. So it's a final. It's a CBB.
Yeah, yeah. It's going in. Yeah.
Going in. And I remember once we had some perfectionists in optical, and there was another shot that had some mistake in the lower right-hand corner. And George accepted it. And the optical supervisor went and reshot it anyway. and showed it all proudly the next day in dailies. And George said, no, I'm not cutting that in the movie. I told you it was done.
Huh.
So it really sent a strong message. Like, if the boss says it's done, it's done. Just because you have a problem with something. Now, I don't actually know, did George cut the real shot, the new shot in or not? I mean, maybe he did.
But it sent the right message. Yeah.
It sent the right message. And George is a very practical man. He's got a producer hat and a director hat. He's not like, some of the directors of today just keep iterating. So the poor studio or effects house, you can't budget. You don't know how many iterations. Well, in my day, you would budget like 3 takes on something or 2 takes on something, 1 model, maybe 2 takes if you're going to blow something up. And so it was a lot easier to budget. Now I don't know how they can budget for these iterations and just keep going until, I mean, you heard that Avatar 2 cost $600 million. $1 million a minute was how we used to budget. So if it's 60 shots, 1 second each, I don't know how people do it. And how do you schedule?
Yeah.
If you're going to iterate and have a pixel fucker there to worry about every single thing. I mean, we would take a lot for granted because it was like, you do the best you can, you get it in the camera, it's done. And now it's a different world. How anyone makes money. I worry about this industry, even though it's exploding. And so, now my motivation is to find the next generation of talent. And what I've discovered is that high school, college kids, they don't have, families. They can dive in and work those long hours. And you kind of need to establish yourself in your career and move up. But once you have a family, I would hope we do more job sharing. I would hope that people are not, unfortunately, USC did University of Southern California did a whole study about why women are such a tiny part of this industry. And we're half the producers, but that's kind of expected. But in terms of like leading compositing, leading painting, leading model making, women don't step up and take that. And the reason they said is because it's an extra 10, 15 hours a week to be the head of a department. And women are already doing 10 hours a day. So that's sort of the norm in this industry. So they want to get home. They want to get home and see their kids and make dinner and tuck them in. And so I really feel there's so few women in leadership positions. And maybe that's why I'm getting mentorship opportunities, because I've, run a studio and run a visual effects house. And so I'm really aware of what that takes. But if you hire the right people and you're good at what you do, you don't need to be there 15 hours a day. But nowadays, I think job sharing would be so wise. Like, why not have 2 women share the job of compositing supervisor on a show, and then maybe only work 4 days a week each, 4 10-hour days. But so what? Then you have that one crossover day. I don't know. But it's really, really a problem, this industry, for women to rise in it. And we're doing everything we can in the VES and ILM and others, BRIC Foundation and California Education. We really want to attract more women and give them opportunities, and people of color.
Yeah.
I mean, this industry is so...
you're missing out on so many potential geniuses at this, I spoke to Paul Franklin, who ran Double Negative DNEG here in London, and he was saying the same stuff, and saying since COVID as well, that he hopes that there is a way to encourage more women to come into the industry now that people are kind of reassessing whether they really want to be working 15-hour days. Our company's going to be forced into allowing job share and, more flexible hours and things like that.
I hope so. And working at home, the downside is you're always working. But the good side is you can go to your kids' football or soccer game or volleyball game. So there's a lot of good. You can make dinner. You can all have dinner together. And once the kids are in bed, you can go back to work if you want, or if you need to. That hopefully will change things. And also just if talent demands it. If you really want somebody, um, I have a friend named Caitlin Yang who's a very successful visual effects supervisor. She's one of 5 women of color. She's in a wheelchair. And she said, she's been in a wheelchair her whole life, and she calls it a mobile device. And she said that COVID was so great for her because you see how these Zoom calls are, you can't see the wheelchair. So they just assumed she wasn't in a wheelchair. And so she got all these jobs.
Yeah,
Whereas
interesting, isn't it? These
wheels in,
prejudices we don't even know we have in a way. We kind of
um,
judge people based on what they look like. Even the most open and willing people.
I remember I was going to hire an assistant when I was running marketing at ILM. And I myself, because I had 3 little kids, I didn't want to hire a mom.
Mm,
Well, I did hire a mom, but I was able to convince upper management that I needed both this woman, Vicki Dobbs, who now runs ILM X Lab, still
mm,
to this day. She was a graduate of the MBA program at Stanford, super smart, super fun. And I wanted her, and I wanted Andy Merrim, who had 2 boys. And so I convinced them that we could up the price and hire both. But if I had only had to hire one, that's how these hidden prejudices go. I wanted
yes.
to leave at 6. I didn't want that other mom to leave at 6. So, oh, terrible.
How did that move into marketing happen then? Did you think I want to go to marketing, or was it something that just kind of fit in with your family life better, or something like that?
I remember I was pregnant with my first child, and I was on Ewok Adventure, a TV movie. I was
Oh yeah.
associate
Well,
producer.
you say TV movie, but here in the UK, of course, it had a cinema release. I saw that in the cinema. I was so
Sorry.
I was so disappointed. Where's Luke
I thought it was
Skywalker?
terrible. Sorry, everybody, but I just thought it was awful. Anyway, so I'm on that movie, and George gives me a book called Self-Esteem of Your Child. And I read that book, and it pointed out the importance of being there and being available. And I thought, I can't be, because I'd taken a leave of absence to run production, and I was associate producer of this movie, which, by the way, the guys, the grips, the gaffers, I never stood on the set. They always pushed a chair under my butt to sit down. They insisted because I was pregnant. So cute. So I decided after reading that book that I can't do production and be a good mom, for my own life balance. So that's when I made the suggestion, why don't we start a marketing department? And that's when I came in with all those, let's start a commercial division. And that's when we brought Jim Morris in to analyze whether or not we should start a commercial division. And now, of course, he's president of Pixar.
Mm-hmm.
So I was supposed to go to Jordan with him. I got a new right hip recently, so I couldn't go to Jordan. It was with Jim Morris, president of Pixar, Lynn Hale, who ran, PR at Disney, well, Lucasfilm and then Disney, and Brooke Breton, who's a board of governors for visual effects at the Academy. It was all first class,
Oh,
fully
wow.
paid trip. And I couldn't go, but they were so nice. And because I didn't want to be the one, limping and slowing everybody down. You'd be very proud of me now. 4 weeks later, I'm walking fine. I feel great.
Great.
But it was a dramatic operation.
Yeah. It's a
Anyhow,
big
now
deal. It is a big deal, right? Yeah.
big deal, new hip. Yeah. Now I've got a little ball and socket in there. Who knows? Anyhow, yeah, so I became marketing director, and I could work 4 days a week. I stayed home every Wednesday. My kids would jump up and down on the bed. Is it Wednesday? Is it Wednesday? And we'd go do something fun.
Nice. Well, it's nice that you work for a company that enabled you to kind of move into a different role and able to. This is it. People need to live their lives a bit, don't they? I mean, yeah, we do have to give our lives over to creative pursuits, but at the same time, there are lives to be lived.
And I don't know that that's doable now. I mean, it was a unique time, and I must have done a really good job because everything I asked for, okay, I'm going to work less, get paid more, they let me do it.
Mm.
And that that was a pretty unusual circumstance.
Hmm.
And then, of course, I was perfect for that marketing job just because I'm fun. I like people. I'm an extrovert. I would go to LA every couple weeks, meet with folks. I mean, oh my gosh, I met so many great directors and producers, and they all wanted us to do their work.
Yeah.
So
And
it
it's
was a really
nice to be able to, sorry, I cut you off there.
not at all.
I was going to say, nice to be able to make that book into the digital realm as well, to kind of collect together a whole bunch of those people that you'd worked with and the work that ILM had done. I loved that book. I mean, I was in love with it. There was the book beforehand as well that was the
Tom
pre-digital.
Smith.
Yeah,
Tom Smith wrote that book. It
yeah.
was the very first book. His sold out like 20 printings.
Huh.
I thought Ballantine made a huge mistake with our book because they made it look so similar to the first book,
Right,
like
yeah.
similar
True.
cover. So people in the bookstore thought, oh, I already own that.
Ah,
So they only did like three printings of that book as opposed to Tom's, which had like 20 printings. But no, that was super fun. It was like sculpting something. I had left ILM at that point. I had just I'd gone to overseas to Japan with at that point we were expanding into theme park and attractions, and there was a whole division about that. And I didn't really like the idea that had been pitched
hmm.
internally. It was for Space Race. I just thought it was banal. And this was going into a water park. So I came up with this amazing idea called Life Cycle of Water. And it was a real 3D, 4D, in theater effects of snow and ice and all the states that water goes through. I thought, oh, this is perfect. I show it to our client, ShowScan. They love it. They think it's brilliant. So I'd convinced the GM at the time, Scott Ross, that it would be the backup. We'd go ahead and let the guys pitch Space Race to Mitsubishi, who was the ultimate client.
Right.
But that I would have this in my back pocket as an alternative, Life Cycle of Water. And the night before we left, I get a call from the GM. Yeah, I met with all the visual effects supervisors. They don't want you competing with them.
Hmm.
So sit on it. Do not share it. And I go to Japan, and the head of Mitsubishi is so disappointed with the pitch.
Huh.
So disappointed. And I'm just sitting on something that I know he'll love, and I was unable to do it. So when I got back, I quit.
Huh.
I quit. And I just said, nope, I'm going to work maybe with the theme park group. Well, then the theme park group got shut down. So I took the job. I suggested the book and got approval and started doing all the interviews. And it was like sculpting. It just every day more pages, Thank God for American cinematographer and Cinefex, because they documented down to I didn't, nobody could remember how many inches a ship was, but that was documented in Cinefex. So yeah, that was a good time. So I definitely stayed involved. I still love ILM. It was like, it's just, I got out of my lane, I switched over to the creative, and that was not acceptable to the other creatives, because I'd always been that efficiency producer.
Interesting.
And yeah, so it's funny. I've always been a creative. I've written a couple books. I wrote a book called Bikini Bonini, and it's a children's book. I live in a house with 4 women, and so I think that's the way of the future is, so I'm blogging about group living.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, so interesting. And I've got like over 100 people that receive my blog, and I just opened up a website called goldenboomers.net where all my blogs can be found. And the latest one is, Can Men and Women Live Together? So I haven't published that one yet.
How are you finding it living with? Is it 4 other women you say, or 3?
There's three others and me,
others,
so there's four of us.
Yeah.
We compete to see who's the most gourmet. So dinner, you only cook every 4 or 5 nights, and it's always fabulous and delicious. We leave each other alone all day. Like, you notice nobody's in this office with me. I'm just on my own all day. Everybody's just busy. One gal makes jewelry and she's off doing shows and making jewelry. Another is she works at a flower shop. She used to be head of production at a big company, but now she's working at a flower shop. So she's gone all day. The other's an editor, but she's just anyway, we're compatible. That's the big difference. One is my sister, and then the other two are good friends of ours. So it makes a difference who you pick in your tribe. And when you have a family, forget it. You don't need that. It's really for elders.
Yeah.
That loneliness is a killer.
Absolutely.
And they say that loneliness is worse than smoking, 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah, I heard that. Yeah.
So that way I can smoke 2 a day, and that way.
Oh, well, it sounds like you've got it kind of sorted there. What is your relationship now then with the filmmaking industry? You worked as a consultant for ILM for a while.
Yeah, I ended up working for all the competition. I worked for Rhythm and Hughes before they went down. I worked until I was about 60. And at that point, everything was digital. Everything went digital. And I didn't really want to be a part of being inside of a room, working with people on computers in the dark. I just really love like real people moving real lights around real sets, which is why I'm excited about virtual production. So I got out of the business at about a decade ago at age 60, and I switched over to the golf industry, where I sold more memberships at a private club than anyone in California ever had.
Wow.
It was great. It was just great. And oh my God, I mean, I played golf for a living. Like I was making 100K, and I worked 4 days a week, 11 to 5, and I would play golf. I mean, what a gig. But I didn't get along. I'm not good with authority. I don't have a good relationship with authority, especially stupid authority and racist authority. Right. So I ended up quitting that really great job. And now I'm still very involved in the industry. I have so many friends in it that I give parties once a year, like 40th anniversary of Jedi's coming up. So we're going to do a party for that at the original joint, we call it. Nice. Where we made it, where we worked on it. We did Empire last year. We did Star Wars a few years ago, 3 years ago. Oh, it was a love fest. I mean, people came, 300, 400 people come. And it was so fun to see everybody, but we are all getting kind of old. So what I do now, I'm in the Visual Effects Society, and I'm going to run for the board in the Bay Area and hopefully get elected, because I want to do screenings. Screenings is the reason to be in the VES. And then you set up little, people talking about the movie and such. So I want to do that. And then parties. I think the whole idea is we are a community and we really show up for each other. Somebody died a couple years ago, Ted Menke. He was such a dear. He was actually the first employee for George Lucas. He was the first person hired for George Lucas on American Graffiti. And he ended up running the stage for us. And he was just a handsome, sweet guy. And when he died, his wife called and asked if I would organize a memorial. So I did. And George Lucas could not have been nicer. He covered all the expenses for security. Wow. He did it. Everything. 300 people showed up. It was a beautiful event. The food was covered. The wine was covered. We did a little show. And his wife is so grateful to this day. So what I'm saying is we have a very strong community and we show up for each other. And when I send out an email saying we're doing this party, save the date, I do it individually so that I get back all the, there's 300 people I'm inviting, but I could just send it out to everybody, BCC. No, I like the fact that they respond to me and say, oh my God, this is so great. Thank you. And then we have these wonderful parties where really we love each other. I mean, It's different. I don't know what it's like now, but I still feel very comfortable calling up, the president of Lucasfilm or whatever, and making suggestions and recommendations because I think now I'm a maven. I just won an award. The Visual Effects Society just awarded me lifetime achievement. No, no, sorry, lifetime membership. Very
Uh-huh.
different. Lifetime membership. Very sweet, very nice. And I gave a speech about how great my hair looked in the academy, in the Light and Magic, and how it's been a big year for me with the Cover Girl story and going to Jordan, although I couldn't go. But they invited me next year. I'll go next year.
Do you know what? All of this stuff, all of your answers really tonight, or tonight for me, this afternoon for you, have been about connection ultimately, connecting with people, just having these relationships with people. I think that's the important thing. And I think what you do is great because you're bringing all these people back together. You're reminding them that they're part of a community. And I think that's what's missing. As technology is advanced, like we're talking now over Zoom, I think we sometimes forget that just being in a room with other people is the thing that keeps us going. It keeps it alive, doesn't it? So I think that's a great
So
message to end
key.
on.
I think family is ultimately
Hmm.
the key. And we were like family
Mm.
on Star Wars. And when you work with people such long hours and you fingers crossed that this thing works out and the joy. I mean, I kind of want to work for NASA because I've been seeing, this great new telescope, the James Webb telescope, and the joy in the room. Somebody just did a documentary about Good Night Opportunity, it's
Mm.
called. Highly recommend it
Mm.
because they keep cutting to the screening room. I mean, the NASA room. That's the feeling that we had.
Mm.
And that's the feeling that we get when we're all together. And when I call it a love fest, that's what I mean. And I think working together makes it so special because you're working towards something and on something. And when you succeed, like we did on Star Wars, I mean, that was above and beyond. I get way more credit on that movie than than I should. But I loved it in Light and Magic when Richard Edlund goes, yeah, I think it was Rose that turned us around. I'm like, no, I didn't. But how
Take it.
sweet of him.
Take
How
the
sweet of him
compliment.
to do that. I called him to thank him.
Did you?
This is a funny story. I called him, after I saw the series and I thanked him. I said, wow, that was so nice of you to give me that kind of credit. And I said, have you seen it? And he said, no, I don't even know if I said, do you have Disney Plus? He goes, I don't know. So I said, well, get your remote and there's a blue icon and you just say Light and Magic, Disney Plus. And he said, oh, I'm afraid of my remote. So I called the head of PR at Disney and said, make sure he has Disney Plus.
Yeah, great. Well, that's nice. Well, listen, I'm so grateful that we've been able to talk because I think, watching you in Light and Magic, as I said before we started recording, it was great to not only see somebody I'd not really seen talk before about their time working with those people and working on those films, but just to see a woman that was there at the time. I'm struggling with this podcast to get women in the industry from the periods I'm talking about, 70s, 80s, 90s. You're
I
the
bet.
third woman now of 64 episodes I've done.
Wow.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat with Rose there. It really was a pleasure to chat. Thanks for your time, Rose. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the suggestion for another guest. I'm following that up as we speak. Next up, I have another Oscar-winning director on the podcast. Yet we don't talk about his films. Lee Unkrich, director of Coco and Toy Story 3, is publishing, along with Taschen and the late J.W. Rinzler, a book called Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. It's this deluxe 3-volume artifact, and I can't wait to see it. Maybe I'm never going to get to see it because it's $1,500 or £1,500. Lovely conversion there. Lee and I have already recorded the conversation just after Christmas, and that will be the first episode of 2023. If you love The Shining, You're going to love the chat, and I'm sure you'll love the book as well. And hopefully there'll be a version that mortals like me can afford to buy. Remember, you can still support the podcast on patreon.com/Jamie Benning. That's JamieBenning. You can pick from several tiers, so check them out before you decide. It really does make a big difference to my being able to continue making these. If you can't support the podcast financially, then please just write a review on Apple Podcasts or share on social media. This podcast is very independent. It really is just me and my laptop and a guest, and sometimes two guests. And I am getting buried by these big corporate film podcasts. I started off doing well in the film history charts, top 10. Now I'm in like the top 70. And I think my guests have got better. And I think the podcast generally has got better. But I keep dropping down. So anything you can do to spread the word would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for joining me for 2022. And I hope you can do so for the next year of episodes of the Filmumentaries podcast in 2023. Happy New Year.